Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, August is a month when nature can be its most vicious, but when you live near wetlands, a river, and a gulf, any time is a good time to pay close attention to nature's mood. ERROL and I will be joined by 3 reporters who are environmental specialists. We'll be looking at, among other issues, coastal restoration, the impact of flooding on the seafood industry, cancer rates along the chemical corridor, and improvements and uncertainties in facing nature. We will look at press coverage and viewer interest, too. Joining us are ERROL LABORDE, producer of Informed Sources, Mark SCHLEIFSTEIN, environmental reporter, the Times-Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate, SARA SNEATH, environmental reporter, the Times-Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate, and Travis Lux, coastal reporter, WWNO Radio, 89.9 FM, right? We're going to go over to Mark first. And global warming. I mean, we hear so much climate change, global warming. We're seeing it.
We are seeing it. The way that we're seeing it most often in South Louisiana is increased rainfall events. It's sort of an odd thing to try to deal with. What we're actually seeing is a pattern where you have more heavy rainfall occurring in a brief period of time, more often during the year, while the total amount of rainfall pretty much stays the same, which is about 60 inches a year. Mm-hmm. But the problem is that our systems, like in the city of New Orleans, are not designed for a 6 to 8 inch an hour rainfall event. So that's a problem. That's one issue. The other one is...
I think still fresh in people's minds of that event the night before Barry came, when there was a sudden storm and nobody knew about it. Is that the future?
Well, yes, that is, and the potential there is that you've got the warm air has the ability of capturing moisture. More moisture. It holds on to it for a longer period of time. And we have Gulf air streaming north from the Gulf of Mexico, and when that occurs, it results in thunderstorms that are bigger and last longer and move over the same locations one after another, which is what happened with that storm. And so that kind of an event can set up. But there are other things that we do need to worry about in South Louisiana. The key one is a worldwide issue, and that is that one of the results of higher temperatures worldwide are a variety of different things that are causing the oceans to swell. The heat itself causes each one of the molecules of water to be larger. So that increases the height of water. In addition to that, you have melting that's occurring in polar ice caps and in different locations where there are all sorts of ice in mountains and things like that. That water ends up in the sea, and it also swells the oceans. So you have higher water, and now you also have an effect that occurs with hurricanes themselves. When during the hurricane season, the problem there is a bit more complicated. The researchers are showing that we may actually see fewer hurricanes in the future, especially after, at the end of this century. But each hurricane is going to be stronger, as much as 10 to 15% stronger. The result of that is that you end up with storm surges that are higher. And then you add that to that already higher water level in the Gulf of Mexico, and our wetlands are already disappearing at a rapid rate. So that storm surge is on top of what is becoming more and more open water along our coast. So that's a significant threat to South Louisiana. Our wetlands, the areas where storm surge can occur, are going to be increasing significantly over the next 100 years.
The wetland subsidence and disappearing?
It's both the subsidence and disappearance, but also the effects of these storms, the fact that the water will be higher as it moves forward during a hurricane. So The result of that is that we're all going to be having to deal with how to protect ourselves from that through coastal master plan, through higher levees, things like that.
Adaptation and such. Sea level rise, what is the projection now for the Louisiana coast, and what will we be facing as we move along in the century?
Well, at the moment, everybody is sort of betting on this sort of moderate range of sea level, which is 8 inches to a foot over the next 50 years, 50 to 75 years. And hopefully that occurs. The worst case scenarios are much worse, 4 to 6 feet. If that happens, all bets are off, and we'll be seeing South Louisiana, a series of pockets surrounded by levees, walled cities.
And then no matter what happens with how much sea level rise there is, of course we're already sinking no matter what. So that adds to the problem of higher water.
So an issue, of course, and a concern is coastal restoration, trying to save what we do have left and maybe build a little bit more. And we live in such a culturally, environmentally rich area. Some of these images that you are seeing around us, taken by photographer P.J. Hahn. Thank you, P.J., for the use of these gorgeous photos. But you know, you'll see the wetlands, you'll see the pelicans, and pelicans, their roosting places have been endangered. So what is the state then doing to try to save us?
Us or the pelicans?
Us and the pelicans.
One thing that the state has done is to rebuild back the barrier islands, and that provides a nesting spot for the pelicans that you were just mentioning. And it also creates somewhat of like a speed bump for hurricanes when they come in. It lessens the impact on our coast. So that has like a 1-2 effect for both them and us. And also other coastal restoration projects that rebuild wetlands do the same thing. They slow down storm surge, and they minimize storm surge to some degree. So that's both beneficial from a standpoint of having habitat for these creatures that we value in our culture, and also to protect us.
Protect our communities, because communities are endangered. People are already moving up. They're making that decision to do that. You mentioned the master plan, Mark.
Right.
One part of the master plan, certainly there's several parts of the master plan, but there is the diversions. And where do we stand now on like the Barataria diversion? These big diversions. Design, build, are we there?
Right now they're in the process of getting permitted through the federal government. It's called the NEPA process. And so they'll be doing environmental evaluations basically on what would be the impacts of that. And they have to consider the social impacts on it and everything. And that's part of this federal process that we're in the middle of.
And the timing of that, they had hoped to push it forward to about 2020 for the completion of the environmental impact statement and the issuance of the permits. It's already slid back a bit because of last year's governmental shutdown and other things. So it's first part of 2021 is now when they're talking about getting those permits, which would be the beginning of construction, and then it'd take probably 3 or 4 years for those two major ones to be built. And then after that, there are a series of other diversions that are planned for different locations along the Mississippi River.
And then there's also beneficial use of dredge material, and that's when really silt from the Mississippi is pumped into an area where land is actually built.
That's true, and the hope of the state is that both of these will be able to be used together by directing material that's dredged from the Mississippi River through pipelines inland to rebuild specific locations where wetlands have the best chance of surviving, and then having those diversions set up so that they can add sediment to those areas to both fill in behind them and also to keep them higher.
We've been hearing about this story for a long time, and it's always down the road. Okay, this project's going to happen. What's the best we can hope for? I mean, is it possible to win this or to curtail it to a certain level, or what?
Yeah, it's curtailment. It's not win. The coast that we see today is not going to be there in 50 years. We will be moving inland some. But the hope is that we'll be able to build wetlands outside of the populated areas to help reduce storm surge. And that's what the focus of the state's program is.
And even the state's master plan says that they're assuming, even under the medium scenario, they're assuming that there will be a net loss still of land. So factoring in all the land that we're building and trying to build with the additional losses that we're going to keep having. So even the state now expects that there's going to be a net loss compared to where we are right now.
We're not going to reclaim or rebuild what has been lost. What has been lost is what, close to what,
No,
2,000 square miles or something like
yeah,
that?
in individual locations we'll see rebuilding, but total, we are going to be losing probably twice as much as what is gained over the next 50 years.
Of course, a big part of the problem was that, the Mississippi River was channeled. Levees were put up for flood protection, which of course we need flood protection, but that interrupted the Mississippi's natural flow over, and the Mississippi is what built this delta. The Mississippi is the reason why the city of New Orleans was established where it was established. And we're seeing now the Mississippi's, is this mighty force and has meant a lot to our whole area. And the Mississippi definitely lets itself be known, and this year it definitely did, because it has been a high river, unprecedented since the beginning of this year now, and the spillway has had to be opened twice, and because of that, the Mississippi has been flowing into the lake, which it normally does not do, and then into certain areas of the Gulf too, and that's caused some problems for the seafood industry.
Yeah, the seafood industry has seen a lot of problems because of the river, and it kind of boils down to the fact that, we have a very productive estuary, basically where the fresh water from the river meets the salty Gulf water, creates like a brackish area that is very productive for a lot of species like crabs and shrimp and oysters, all things that people in Louisiana love to eat. But this year there's been such an influx of fresh water that it's kind of pushed out all the salty water, and that's caused problems for a lot of these critters who need kind of a mix. A lot of them can deal with some fluctuation, but it's been tough for them to deal with this constant flow of water from the river. And so that's caused a lot of problems for Louisiana and Mississippi. In Louisiana, in both states, the governors have filed emergency declarations, fisheries disasters, looking for help from the federal government for some of the losses. The losses on the order of, in the state of Louisiana, close to 90% of oysters on public grounds that's how much the catch went down. In Mississippi, when they filed their declaration, said that 70% of their oysters had died. So in shrimp and other species, it's a similar story. So it's been tough for people who make their living on the water.
And this is just the most recent event like that. There have been, since Katrina, there have been 5 or 6 similar freshwater years where fishers have really been hurt.
Right, as I've been reporting about this stuff, people are comparing it to those events. They're saying, you got Katrina, you've got BP, and now you have the 2019 river flood. It's that bad for the fisheries.
And of course, the Mississippi River, it starts its flow up there at Lake Itasca in Minnesota and makes its way through the country down to us. And along the way, it picks up a lot of water. It also picks up a lot of sediment. It also picks up a lot of what the agricultural industry puts on the earth, and then it washes into the water, and that then in turn causes trouble for the Gulf of Mexico with the dead zone.
It does, and part of the same thing that is causing the dead zone also caused part of the problem from the fresh water coming through the diversion and from other locations along the Mississippi coast, and that is this huge bloom of algae that occurred this year. Basically, you've got nutrients, it's basically fertilizer that's coming down from the Midwest, and it gets into the Gulf. It creates a bloom of algae is eating this stuff, and that algae dies, it sinks to the bottom, and it decomposes, and the little things eat it and all that sort of stuff. But that decomposition, because you got fresh water on top of salt water, that is keeping air from the surface from getting to that bottom salt water where it's decomposed, results in no oxygen being in that lower area. And so anything that lives there in the sediments on the bottom dies, and fish and shrimp that can avoid it, they either go out farther into the Gulf of Mexico, or They create what are called jubilees, where they all come running to the shore and end up grounding themselves, and you have big fish kills from that as well. So it's a real problem, and this year it's looking to be a rather significant one in terms of the amount of area that will be determined to be.
But is there an alternative to opening the floodgates other than flooding the cities? I mean, is there something else we could say we should be doing this instead?
Well, in terms of the nutrient problem, yeah, there are alternatives. They're all upstream. It's basically redesigning the way that we farm in the Midwest to assure that those nutrients are reused on the farmland and not dropped into the water, to find ways of capturing them by building wetland areas around farms in the Midwest and having those wetlands take up the nutrients, different things like that. Finding ways to farm with less fertilizer is another thing that can be done. And a lot of those things have been attempted voluntarily over the years, but those voluntary attempts, you know, they keep pushing back the date for when they're going to meet this level of trying to reduce the amount of the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico,
right.
and it's just not working.
It hasn't been enough yet. Of course, the Mississippi is it's a big environmental benefit for our area. You know, we have industry on it and along it, but there's also concern that some of the industry, particularly the chemical plants, might be causing an increase in cancer rates. But have we found that to be the case, really?
Well, since 2016, LSU has been able to put out reports on cancer rates by the census, census tract, and it's kind of varied what we see. I think that before the LSU was doing that, we saw the EPA put out the cancer risk, and they were analyzing the risk by looking at toxins that these plants emit and then evaluating the people who are being exposed to that, and they were saying that based on that, they were seeing an increased risk. Some of the highest risk areas in the U.S. are along the Mississippi River in Louisiana. But when we see the LSU evaluate how many people actually have cancer, that's a harder thing to nail down. So we know that the risk is higher, but are we seeing that in the actual number of people who have cancer? I think if you talk to people in those communities, they will say yes. But as far as like the science shows, I think it's still left to be determined, just because we don't have enough years of analysis yet. Those years of analysis are the last 2 years that LSU has put them out. It's been these huge numbers of like 10 or 15 years, which makes it difficult. Also, when they're looking at the number of people who have reported cancer in those areas, they're oftentimes talking about someone who is diagnosed. Well, we don't know where they lived before they were diagnosed. They might have moved to another area of the state after they were diagnosed because they felt like they were sick and they needed to be close to a hospital. And so they were diagnosed in an area that they were not in when they were exposed to the toxin that made them get cancer. So I think it's a difficult thing to nail down from a scientific perspective, but from a narrative of people who live in those areas, I think they will say yes, that they definitely have a higher risk.
But there is a research method called the tumor registry, is that correct?
That's correct.
So is that helping us sort of determine maybe what kinds of cancers are happening more often in certain areas?
Yeah, I think that the tumor registry is helping us to at least get some numbers. And like I said, it's not a perfect way to get the numbers, but I think that it is helping us to see some problem areas. And what could also be done which is often done in science, is that you use something like this, and then you come up with questions afterward. Why does this area have a higher risk? And then there should be a separate study on that area. Which we're not seeing that yet, but because of funding issues. But that could be a stem off of the LSU tumor registry at some point.
But the bottom line is, in terms of risk, this state has one of the highest risks of cancer.
Based on the EPA's toxins report, they say that that, yeah, there are communities in Louisiana that have the highest risk due to air toxins.
And what area in this metro area has the highest risk? Did I read
In New
something?
Orleans?
Yeah.
Well, in LSU's tumor registry last year that they put out, nope, this year, they put it out this year, but it was covering the period, I think that extended till last year, was it found that the second highest rate of second highest statistically significant, that's an important phrase that they use there, is in the Desire neighborhood.
And did I read something about the CBD also? The CBD?
The CBD is #1 in the state. That's correct, yeah.
That's a head scratcher there, the CBD.
It is,
#1.
yeah.
Okay.
I wonder how, I mean, I don't even know how many people live in the CBD. I would be interested to know
Yeah,
why
to
that.
find, you know, continuing research on that. All right, Sarah, thanks a lot. ERROL, press coverage of just not only, you know, what our environment, what's happening to our environment, but events too.
Well, yeah. Well, there's so many stories, and it's hard to encompass them all. Obviously, whenever there's a story that threatens people, like a hurricane coming, you get a lot of reaction to that. And, you know, the thing about the hurricane is that the terminology and language of hurricane coverage has really changed over the last maybe 15 years. You used to never hear about invest. All of a sudden, they're talking about that word. You used to never hear the word cyclone applied to our hurricanes. I mean, the first time I heard somebody talking about a cyclone here, I thought they were talking about Indonesia or something, and so that language has changed. You used to never see the spaghetti models that you see. But overall, I mean, I guess it's more accurate. I mean, it seems like what we saw reasonably. I mean, you know, they're very careful, and we know with their cones and everything, but I thought they did a good job. In terms of some of the long-range things, I do know in the magazine business, there was a time when magazines were doing like green issues, and as a rule, they didn't sell very well. And I think it's not because people weren't interested in the environment, it's just that they're long-term, very complex stories, you know, and they're kind of hard, to grab to. Coastal erosion, thank God you're covering that, but you're just like, okay, like the question I asked, all right, when do we get there? And at what point? And I'm still baffled by the football fields. I mean, it seems to me, okay, it seems to me we should be at Shreveport right now with all that. And so sometimes I think it's a hard story for people to hold on. But one good sign, and we see at this table right here, is that this is an area of journalism in which there are people doing grants that are hiring talented young reporters, and both of you are examples of that, to go work in different places. And Mark has developed a team at the Picayune and the Advocate. And so in terms of the expertise that we're getting, you know, I think that's a very good sign.
Because it's really important information that the community needs to be aware of. This is a real threat. This is not fake news. The Louisiana coast has been disappearing, and because of that, we're more endangered by storms, by big storms. We don't have that natural buffer anymore. The community needs to be kept informed, so you guys have your jobs to do.
Well,
You definitely do.
We're doing our, I think we're doing our best. You know, the reality that we face is that we do live in a community that is rather conservative, and while they may not agree on the causes of why our wetlands are disappearing, it may not see that connection to climate change that some of the reporters do and that a lot of the scientists do, that they do see that things are changing rather dramatically, and our job is to try to explain it in the best way possible to assure that people have enough information to make good decisions when they, you know, do something simple like go to the voting booth.
Because people can make a change in their own lives, and that is one thing that, of course, is built into the master plan too, is this non-structural change, and it's basically urging the community member, take a look at where you live and what you need to do to adapt to this changing environment. So are we seeing that, do you find? Are people taking note of this?
Well, I think the problem is that there hasn't been funding identified for that. And I think it's one thing for people to evaluate for themselves, but if someone has lived in a community their whole life and they're the third generation in a community, not only do might not they have the money to get up and move, but they also just might not have the, you know, cultural will to do that. I think it's up to the state to help provide some avenues and make it more accessible for people to both lay out the area exactly. We have enough, I think the state has enough information to lay out where are repeated flood areas, where are areas that are going to become more susceptible to flooding, and create avenues for people to start retreating if they want to.
Where they don't have the money is providing people with the information they need to make some basic judgment decisions. Gee, I live in New Orleans, and because we have this brand new levee system, my house's base flood elevation has dropped, so now I'm in an X zone, so gee, I don't have to get flood insurance. No, that's not what that means. What that means is that as a result of that levee system that we all paid for, you are being given better protection, but the reality is that you have the same 1% chance of being flooded as a result of that new levee system, and you should go ahead and spend that little extra money to get flood insurance because it's a great investment when something does happen.
And some of the other advice, of course, is elevating your home. That takes money.
Absolutely.
Floodproofing your home. That takes money. Yeah, it's not cheap.
And some of those issues are things that I think the city has missed on, especially in the aftermath of Katrina. There was a huge effort to get this city rebuilt as quickly as possible. And one of the things that happened as a result of that was that people were given the opportunity to rebuild. I know my house had 15 feet of water in it, and when the city inspectors came by, they said, oh, well, it's 47% damage, which meant I was eligible to rebuild on the same footprint without elevating. Big mistake, I think, that the city made in doing that.
And issues that we're certainly going to have to consider and be aware of as we move along. So let's talk about that. You guys each have about 20 seconds or so to talk about the next 10 years, where we're going to be with this whole issue of climate change and coastal erosion. What you think, E?
Well, I'll defer to Mark first because you cut me off guard here, okay?
We'll go to you, Mark.
Well, actually, I think one of the things we're really going to see is a heck of a lot of work on coastal restoration because we got a big shot in the arm from about $15 billion that's being poured in from the BP oil spill and from offshore oil money. So that's a real benefit.
So we're going to keep trying to save our land and our culture. Sarah?
Well, back to the idea of adaptation, I think it's a great sign that Chip Klein, the new head of CPRA, is saying that it's a real problem that CPRA hasn't addressed adaptation enough. And I think the first way to solve a problem is to identify that there is a problem.
Yeah, I think you'll start seeing more people elevating their homes as we start seeing more and more of these crazy flooding events and rain events. I think the coast, who knows what the coast is going to look like? It could be so many different things.
Yeah.
It could be a lot more full with some of these projects being built in the ground, but then of course, like we were talking about earlier, there's going to be continued loss too. So
Variables, many variables.
about
And
the
you
same.
got to go real quick.
Okay, I measure progress by pelicans, all right? And the more pelicans you see, the better things are. Right before Katrina, there was a huge comeback of pelicans. You were starting to see pelicans all over the place.
Then we
and
see
then
them
after
behind
Katrina,
Mark and
they
Travis
never
right
came
now.
back. And so more pelicans in the future. And a new metaphor to take the place of the football analogy. We need that too.
All right, guys. Thanks a lot. Very interesting discussion. Thanks so much for being here. Thank you all for joining us. We'll see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.